Like and subscribe to Sinister Shadow Studio, Lockdown Nightmare. I never thought I'd experience a school lockdown, let alone one that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was a gloomy October afternoon, the air heavy with the scent of impending rain, when our ordinary day took a sinister turn. I sat in my 7th grade classroom, my mind wandering through the dull droning of the history teacher's lecture. Just as the clock ticked away the last minutes of class, the intercom system crackled to life. Principal Miller's voice quivered with an unsettling urgency as he announced, "Attention, students and staff. We are initiating a lockdown procedure. Please follow the lockdown protocol immediately." A collective murmur swept through the classroom as anxiety rippled through our veins. Lockdown drills were routine, but this felt different. Our teacher, Mrs. Jenkins, sprang into action, hurriedly ushering us into a corner of the room, out of sight from the windows. "Stay quiet, everyone," she urged, her voice trembling. "This is just a precaution. We'll be fine." The minutes dragged on like hours, and the tension in the room grew palpable. Outside, the rain began to pour, its rhythmic tapping against the windows a cruel reminder of our helplessness. We huddled together, unsure of what was happening, when a new voice echoed through the intercom, making my heart race. "Attention, everyone. This is not a drill. Lock all doors and windows. Do not leave your classrooms. I repeat, this is not a drill." Panic coursed through my veins, and I exchanged a worried glance with my classmates. The lockdown protocol was supposed to be a precautionary measure, but this felt like something straight out of a nightmare. Mrs. Jenkins, her face now drained of color, fumbled with her keys to lock the classroom door. The sound of the lock sliding into place sent shivers down my spine. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind howling like a malevolent spirit. I checked my phone, hoping to find a message from my parents, but there was no signal. It was as if we were cut off from the outside world, trapped in this ominous silence. Time passed in a blur, and the initial fear gave way to a numbing sense of dread. Our teacher tried to maintain our composure by reading aloud, but her trembling voice betrayed her unease. As the minutes turned into hours, my mind began to wander to darker thoughts. What if this wasn't a drill? What if there was a real threat? Just as my thoughts spiraled into a labyrinth of fear, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. It was not from our classroom, but from somewhere nearby. The class fell silent, eyes wide with terror, as we strained to listen for any clue about what was happening. Another scream, this one closer, followed by a chorus of frantic whispers and footsteps echoing through the hallways. Panic swept through our class like wildfire. Mrs. Jenkins, no longer able to maintain her facade of composure, whispered, "Stay quiet, children. We'll be okay." The intercom crackled to life once more, Principal Miller's voice trembling with desperation. "Attention, everyone. Do not leave your classrooms under any circumstances. The police are on their way. Stay hidden and stay silent." The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. The screams and cries grew louder, interspersed with unintelligible shouts and the sound of breaking glass. I clutched my backpack tightly, the only weapon I could find in our classroom. My classmates huddled together, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. Then, a sudden, bone-chilling silence descended upon the school. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist. We held our breath, waiting for any sign of hope or rescue. But what happened next shattered our hopes entirely. The lights in our classroom flickered, then went out, plunging us into darkness. The emergency lights above provided feeble illumination, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Mrs. Jenkins urged us to stay calm, her voice quivering, but her reassurances could do little to quell the rising terror that gripped us. In the dim light, I could see my classmates' faces contorted with fear. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an hour. And then, a faint, haunting whisper began to echo through the classroom. At first, it was indistinct, a mere murmur in the shadows. But as the minutes dragged on, it grew louder, more sinister. It was a voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It spoke in a language I couldn't understand, a guttural, otherworldly chant that sent shivers down my spine. I glanced at my classmates, their faces pale and horrified, and realized that I wasn't the only one hearing it. The voice grew louder, more menacing, and I could feel a growing sense of malevolence in the air. Just as I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the lights flickered back on, and the eerie chant abruptly ceased. Mrs. Jenkins checked her watch, her hands trembling. Hours had passed since the lockdown began, and the school was still eerily silent. We waited, our hearts pounding in our chests, until at last, the sound of sirens pierced the air. The police had arrived. Relief washed over us as we heard the shouts and orders of law enforcement officers outside our classroom. As they swept through the school, our door was finally opened, and we were ushered out into the cold, rainy night. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that felt forever changed. I looked back at the school, the place that had been our refuge and our prison, and wondered what had truly happened during those endless hours of terror. To this day, I still don't know the full story of that nightmarish lockdown gone wrong. The official explanation was vague, and the events remained shrouded in mystery. But one thing was certain: I would never forget the feeling of helplessness and fear that had engulfed us all, and the haunting whisper that still echoed in the darkest corners of my mind: the lockdown. The school day had been dragging on as usual, and my classmates and I eagerly counted down the minutes until the final bell. Our math teacher, Mrs. Collins, was in the middle of explaining the intricacies of geometry when the intercom buzzed to life. Principal Johnson's voice, usually calm and composed, sounded agitated as he announced, "Attention, students and staff. We are initiating a lockdown procedure. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Please follow the lockdown protocol immediately." An uneasy hush fell over the classroom as we exchanged bewildered glances. Lockdown drills were part of our routine, but this message had an urgency we'd never heard before. Mrs. Collins immediately locked the classroom door and instructed us to take cover in the far corner of the room, away from the windows. "Stay quiet and stay together," she urged, her voice shaking slightly. "We'll be okay." As we huddled together, fear coursed through the room. The minutes stretched into an eternity, and the silence was broken only by hushed whispers and muffled sobs. Anxiety hung heavy in the air as we tried to comprehend the reason for this unexpected lockdown. Just when I thought the tension couldn't grow any thicker, the intercom crackled to life again, Principal Johnson's voice quivering with dread. "This is not a drill. Lock all doors and windows. Do not leave your classrooms. I repeat, do not leave your classrooms." My heart pounded in my chest as I clutched my phone, desperate to reach out to my parents for reassurance. But there was no signal, and a sense of isolation settled over us like a suffocating blanket. It was as though we were trapped in our own private nightmare, cut off from the outside world. Minutes turned into hours, and a sense of hopelessness pervaded the room. The storm clouds outside mirrored the growing darkness within me. The distant sound of sirens offered a glimmer of hope that help was on the way, but it felt distant and far too late. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the hallways, followed by more cries and shouts that grew nearer with each passing second. Panic gripped us, and Mrs. Collins struggled to maintain her composure as we listened to the chaos unfolding outside. "Stay quiet, everyone," she whispered, though her own voice trembled. "We'll be okay." The screams and chaos intensified, and then the intercom came to life once more. But this time, it wasn't Principal Johnson's voice. It was something else entirely, something chilling and unnatural. A haunting, otherworldly chant filled the air, a language I couldn't understand, but its malevolence was unmistakable. The chant seemed to emanate from all directions, as if it were closing in on us. My classmates and I exchanged terrified glances, unable to comprehend the source of this eerie and ominous presence. The temperature in the room dropped, and a growing sense of uneasy settled in my stomach. Just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the lights in the classroom flickered and then went out, plunging us into darkness. The emergency lights overhead provided feeble illumination, casting eerie shadows on the walls. It felt as though we had been swallowed by the abyss. I clutched my phone, its dim flashlight the only source of light in the room. My classmates huddled together, their faces etched with fear. I tried to call for help, but there was still no signal, and the sinister chant continued to echo in our ears. Time lost all meaning in that darkness, and I had no way of knowing how much time had passed. It felt like an eternity, a never-ending nightmare. And then, just as suddenly as the lights had gone out, they flickered back to life, revealing the terrified faces of my classmates. Mrs. Collins checked her watch, her hands trembling. Hours had passed since the lockdown began, but we were still in the dark about what was happening outside. The eerie silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant sound of sirens. At last, the sound of sirens grew louder, and relief washed over us as we heard the commotion outside. The police had arrived. We were finally safe. The classroom door was opened, and we were ushered out into the cold, rainy night. As I looked back at the school, the place that had become a prison during those harrowing hours, I couldn't help but wonder what had transpired. The official explanation was vague, and the events remained shrouded in mystery. But one thing was certain. I would carry the memory of that nightmarish lockdown with me forever, a chilling reminder that darkness can descend even in the most ordinary of places, and that sometimes the true horror lies within the unknown, the lockdown abyss. I never thought I'd experience a school lockdown gone wrong, but that fateful day in my junior year of high school would forever be etched in my memory as the stuff of nightmares. It was a crisp October morning, and I had settled into my first period math class, the drone of equations and formulas filling the air. Mrs. Wilson, our teacher, was mid-sentence when the intercom system crackled to life. Principal Turner's voice, usually calm and collected, sounded tense as he announced, "Attention students and staff, we are initiating a lockdown procedure. Please follow the lockdown protocol immediately. This is not a drill." A wave of unease swept through the classroom. Lockdown drills were common, but this announcement felt different. The sudden urgency in Principal Turner's voice was enough to send shivers down my spine. Mrs. Wilson, with a hint of panic in her eyes, sprang into action, directing us to the corner of the room away from the windows. "Quiet, everyone," she urged. "This is just a precaution. We'll be fine." As we huddled together in the dimly lit corner, fear began to tighten its grip on my chest. The minutes stretched on, and the silence was only broken by the muffled whispers of my classmates. We exchanged nervous glances, speculating about the reason for this unexpected lockdown. Just when I thought I couldn't bear the tension any longer, the intercom came to life again, Principal Turner's voice trembling as he spoke. "Attention, everyone. This is not a drill. Lock all doors and windows. Do not leave your classrooms. I repeat, this is not a drill." A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I felt my heart rate quicken. This was no ordinary lockdown. Something was terribly wrong, and the atmosphere in the room grew increasingly suffocating. I fumbled for my phone, hoping for some answers or reassurance from my parents, but there was no signal. It was as if we were trapped in a world of uncertainty, cut off from the outside. Time dragged on, and the anxiety in the room became palpable. The minutes turned into hours, and the storm clouds outside darkened the already gloomy classroom. As the distant sound of sirens pierced the silence, I exchanged concerned glances with my classmates. Our hopes for a swift resolution were dwindling. Then, it happened. A bone-chilling scream pierced the air, echoing through the hallways. It was followed by a chorus of panicked shouts and cries, growing louder and closer with each passing second. Fear clutched at my heart, and I watched as Mrs. Wilson struggled to maintain her composure. "Stay quiet, everyone," she whispered, but her voice trembled, and her eyes betrayed her own fear. The screams and chaos outside intensified, and the intercom crackled to life once more. But this time, it wasn't Principal Turner's voice. It was something else, something unnatural and chilling. A guttural, otherworldly chant filled the air, a language I couldn't understand, but that sent shivers down my spine. The chant seemed to come from all directions, as if it were closing in on us. My classmates and I exchanged terrified glances, unable to comprehend the source of this eerie and malevolent presence. The room grew colder, and I felt a growing sense of unease in the pit of my stomach. Just as I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, The lights in the classroom flickered and then went out, plunging us into darkness. The emergency lights overhead cast eerie shadows, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the muffled sounds of the outside world. It felt like we were suspended in a nightmarish void. I clutched my phone tightly, its feeble flashlight providing a sliver of light in the suffocating darkness. My classmates huddled closer, their faces pale with fear. I tried to call for help, but there was still no signal, and the chant continued to echo in my mind. Time lost all meaning in that darkness, and I had no way of knowing how much time had passed. It felt like an eternity, a never-ending nightmare. And then, as suddenly as the lights had gone out, they flickered back to life, revealing the terrified faces of my classmates. Mrs. Wilson checked her watch, her hands trembling. Hours had passed since the lockdown began, but we were still in the dark about what was happening outside. The oppressive silence hung in the air like a heavy shroud. At last, the sound of sirens pierced the silence, and relief washed over us as we heard the commotion outside. The police had arrived. We were finally safe. As I looked back at the school, the place that had become a prison during those harrowing hours, I couldn't help but wonder what had transpired. The official explanation was vague, and the events remained shrouded in mystery. But one thing was certain. I would carry the memory of that nightmarish lockdown with me forever, a chilling reminder that darkness can descend even in the most ordinary of places, and that sometimes the true terror lies within the unknown. Like and subscribe to Sinister Shadow Studio.